This is a video on how to read an academic article quickly. This has helped me personally, and it's the strategy I used when I was trying to get through many different articles to determine if it would be a useful resource when I need to write papers for school. Hopefully, this strategy would help you too. To start, I highly encourage you to do two things. First, is to print out the article so you have a paper copy of it. Second, is to get and use a pen when reading. A pen is much better than a highlighter because you can underline and write notes on the side of the article. These notes you leave for yourself describe the argument the author is trying to make in that section. Therefore, in the future when you go back to the article you can quickly locate a specific argument and will not forget what that section of the article is arguing. After getting your pen and having a printed copy of your academic article, you are going to start looking for a few things to tell you the point, the goal, and the argument of the article. Finding these 3 points will tell you the purpose of the article and how the author plans to prove it. Therefore, you should always look out for a sentence or sentences that identifies the point, goal, and argument of the article. In general, identifying the goal of the article should come first since it is usually located in the first couple of paragraphs. Next, you should look for the thesis of the article, which is usually located in the introduction as well. Lastly, you should look for different controlling statements throughout the article. Before we go any further, the goal of a paper is a sentence or sentences that clearly articulates what the paper aims to achieve. The thesis statement is a concise sentence or two that clearly and directly expresses the main argument of the paper. A controlling statement guides and supports the development of the central point of the paper. Unlike blogs or news articles, academic articles are structured, and these are essential elements, so with practice you should always be able to find it. After identifying the goal, thesis, and different control statements of the article, it should be enough information for you to determine if the article is a useful resource for the paper you need to write. If it's not, put it down, and go on to the next article and repeat the process. Using the example of this article I used when I was in school, I'll show how I can determine if an article would be a useful source for my paper. The article here is titled, Canada's Immigration Policy and Domestics from the Caribbean, the Second Domestic Scheme by Agnes Calliste. The goal of the article is, this study examines the Caribbean domestic scheme in Canada from 1955 to 1967 and argues the growing demand for cheap domestic labor in Canada was the crucial stimulus for the scheme. At the same time, other economic and political factors played a role in the initiation and continuation of this immigration scheme. The thesis of this article is, the domestic scheme did not indicate liberalization of Canada's immigration policy. On the contrary, it showed the racial, patriarchal, and class biases underlying Canadian policy. Prior to 1962, the entry of black immigrants had been severely restricted except when they were needed as a cheap pool of labor. They provided a reserve army of labor for predominantly unskilled work which white workers were not willing to do. Two control statements in the article are, Canada's immigration policies have been shaped by the demand for cheap labor, as well as racial, ethnic, gender and class biases which have discriminated against women of color, particularly Black Caribbean women. Another is, despite Canada's demand for cheap labor, its immigration policies were selective in terms of race, ethnicity, and gender according to the needs of the labor market. Race and gender ideologies were used to justify the domination, exclusion, and restriction of blacks, and other people of color, particularly women. After finding the goal statement, thesis, and two controlling statements, I was able to determine what this article is trying to achieve, their main argument, and information that develops and supports the main argument. In the case of this example, I know that the article's goal is to argue that the growing demand for cheap domestic labor in Canada was a crucial stimulus for the scheme. The main argument is that the scheme did not liberalize Canadian immigration policy but showed racial, patriarchal, and class biases as they needed a cheap pool of labor. To support this, they argued racial, ethnic, gender, and class biases have discriminated against women of color. Race and gender ideologies were used to justify the domination, exclusion, and restrictions towards people of color and especially women. After knowing this information gathered by identifying the goal, thesis, and two controlling statements, I knew that this article is useful for my paper. I kept reading and wrote down notes on the side on specific points the author used to argue to reinforce their thesis. As you can see in this example, I have written down what the paragraph is talking about. One paragraph talks about the effects of colonialism, another is about Black, Indigenous, and people of color. There are paragraphs about stereotypes, immigration, and many more. When I go back in the future to use this as a resource for my paper, I will know what each paragraph is about and look for the information I need there. However, if I thought the information I found from the goal statement, thesis, and two controlling statements were not useful for my own paper, I would have stopped reading there and moved on to another article. There is no need to see the points the author is trying to make to reinforce their thesis if it won't be a helpful source in your paper. A quick tip. At the end of the article, there should be endnotes or citations, so if you found this article useful and want information similar to this, you can look at the sources the author used to write this article. This will help you find related articles quickly, saving you some time when you are searching through databases of articles to use as resources. Using this method, I was able to get through academic articles much quicker. It allowed me to filter which articles would be useful and which articles won't be. Also, by writing down notes beside paragraphs and underlining certain sentences, I can easily find information I am looking for later. From finding the goal, thesis, and controlling statements, it allows me to know exactly what the academic article is trying to argue and prove, which is enough for me to know if it would be useful for my own paper. Thank you for tuning in, and if you found this video informative, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.